So, as Nick said, the Speaker Hall lecture concludes our annual series of lectures, which began back in October. The series has included contributions from Professor Rachel Weber from the University of Illinois Chicago, talking about her recent and now award-winning book on boom and bust in the commercial real estate sector in Chicago. Professor Nicole Guerin from the University of Sydney on planning responses to the crisis of housing affordability. There, Professor Alex Schwartz from the New School in New York City, speaking about the planning policies of Mayor Bill de Blasio, and Anna Rose, head of planning at Milton Keynes, speaking on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the founding of the new town and about its current and future challenges. We reserve the Sir Peter Hall lecture for somebody of exceptional achievement in our field. And tonight's speaker certainly meets that criterion. John Forrester is Professor of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University. He was educated as an engineer, mechanical engineer, at the University of California, Berkeley, receiving his bachelor's and master's degrees there in 1970-71, and then completed a Master of City Planning and a PhD also at Berkeley. In 1998, Professor Forrester was appointed chair of the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell, a position he held until 2001. He remained there since and served as Associate Dean of the College of Architecture, Art and Planning. Outside the university, he served for 20 years as a mediator for the Community Dispute Resolution Center of Tompkins County in New York State. I assume it's in New York State, yeah. And as a consultant for the Consensus Building Institute, giving you a bit of an insight into his concerns. He's lectured at many universities around the world and has spent time at the Amsterdam Center for Conflict and Negotiation at the University of Amsterdam. He's one of the most cited researchers in our discipline and has made major contributions to scholarship, including influential books such as Critical Theory of Public Life, Planning in the Face of Power, which is on many reading lists here, Deliberative Practitioner, etc. Planning in the Face of Power. Each of these books has had a significant impact on planning debates. Planning in the Face of Power, for instance, is a highly influential book which has many citations and which asks fundamental questions about our field. Among these are, why do our best laid plans often overreach and underachieve? Why do our attempts to solve problems in some rational way often fall foul of politics and power? These seem to be central questions for all of us. Very important questions in an era, for instance, when the very value of planning is being questioned by politicians and others in the UK and elsewhere. A key theme of Professor Forrester's work concerns the way that the exercise of power shapes planning outcomes and how planners can operate effectively in a world of conflict. His most recent work explores the promise of a critical pragmatism in planning, and I think this will be the theme of his lecture this evening. So, without further ado, let me say to John, welcome to London, welcome to UCL, welcome to Bartlett, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to be speaking about improvisation, and I'm going to have to do it as well because I've prepared a formal lecture, and we don't have a podium, so we'll figure out a way to make a podium for a moment. With the iPad will help us. And if I'm not blinded, wonderful, yes, great. Fabulous, that'll do it. So I've been fascinated for a long time about what planners actually do. So I'm in the City and Regional Planning Department at Cornell. I'm the house anthropologist. I meet people, they say, oh, you're in city planning. They ask about this. I say the rest of the faculty study cities, I study planners. So that's where we're going. I mean, how boring, right? Except if you're in the planning field, we might want to have a better understanding about what these natives really do and how they do it. And as I will explain, the literature has not been all that helpful. So it's an honor to be here, of course, and especially to work on something that is in progress. And so I very much look forward to questions, criticisms. I will write them down. I will try to answer them if I can in the moment, and otherwise, as we work on it. So thanks, John, for the introduction, of course. I'm honored to have the opportunity to do this annual lecture. Sir Peter came to the Department of City and Regional Planning at Berkeley just as I was finishing my doctoral studies. He had been a lifelong student of cities, and I would become a lifelong student of city planners. Now, if Sir Peter thought and wrote, as he put it shortly before his death, about how cities are structured through their networks, through transport, ways in which innovation, enterprise, and segregation are all influenced by these kind of connectivities, I've tried to write in a different but complementary vein about the ways that planners might ever translate good ideas about cities into practical results, the ways planners might work and learn with others, the ways they might acknowledge power and inequality, conflicting demands from multiple publics, and still actually improve our cities. Sir Peter's work actually leaves us with at least two very different challenges. One rests squarely in social science as we know it. The other, as we shall see, reaches into terrains of practice studies that link theories of improvisation with those of deliberation and ethics. When Sir Peter wrote of his abiding fascination with Kondratiev waves of innovation, he expressed the continuing hope that a post-war social science might better explain the growth and change of cities. He wrote, too, if somewhat more guardedly, of coming, as he put it, he says, question the whole basis of the rational approach to planning. And he came to argue, as he said, for a sophisticated muddling through approach. And adapting a phrase of Dahl and Lindblom, he called it a jointed incrementalism, or even echoing Amitai Etzioni, a mixed scanning. In this second vein, Sir Peter suggested that understanding cities differed from knowing how to change cities. Right? That understanding cities differed from knowing how to change cities. And he wrote proudly, if poignantly, of the visionary plan for the new town in Mid Wales that he had worked on, and as he said, that tragically fell foul of local parochial politics and was never built. In this lecture, I want to examine this second practical challenge, how we might, in his words, fall less foul of politics, how we might think about planning analysis and vision in no less right, but perhaps an ever more practical way. So to do that, I'll have to reach well beyond the labels, muddling through, jointed incrementalism, mixed scanning, to give a far more detailed account of the complex work of planners who, as they try to seek multiple and conflicting public goals and benefits, always try to connect, as John Friedman, the second speaker in this series, as John Friedman put it, the worlds of knowledge and action. I'll try to suggest essentially a practical theory, even if that seems self-contradictory. Working from cases and theory too, I'll offer a grounded account of planning practice, an account not of cities and surely not simply of plan making, but one of practically improvising in realistically messy settings, creatively and pragmatically planning in settings that are complex and contentious, fluid and uncertain, historically and politically fraught. When pressed to give a general label to this approach, I've called it, as John suggested, simply a critical pragmatism. Critical because it has to be attentive to issues of difference, privilege, and power generally. A pragmatism because it must plainly suggest actual city-shaping practices that we as diverse city planners can and arguably should carry out. So in what follows then, after some brief stage setting, I'll sketch for you 3 planning stories from the City Hall of Cleveland, Ohio, from New Orleans, Louisiana in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and from Albuquerque, New Mexico, following a local, if not a great, planning disaster. From these diverse experiences, we'll see how astute public-serving planning might anticipate conflict, negotiate differences, leverage expertise, and produce results in shared ways across widely differing contexts. But how in the world would that be possible, improvising practically and creatively, yet similarly across such very different contexts? That's the problem that I want to explore with you. So when I'm done with the three stories, I hope you will say there's nothing that these people share in common. And my burden will be to show you, in fact, they're doing things deeply similar and politically interesting. So by focusing our attention first on urban change-making efforts rather than the history of cities, I'm adopting what we can call a bias for practice. This is a less extreme move than it might seem. If we're concerned with how to care for an aging parent, we might do well to learn from other thoughtful and experienced caregivers, not to study the history of parenting. Right? To assume that we might learn from other caregivers, and by extension, learn from other planners or placemakers, is just to suggest that we can learn from the qualities of imagination and insight, responsiveness and interaction that they reveal in their work. Our own planning theorists, in quotes, our own planning theorists have often been less than helpful here. For too long, planning theory has kept what I call a dirty little secret, and I'll tell you what the secret is. The secret is this: somebody has to do the work, right, in planning theory. Right? It makes little sense to go on and on about planning and ignore who does the work and what the actual work involves. Vision rarely carries the day. Criticism too easily lapses into complaint, and neither typically produce constructive action. Vision, criticism, complaint all rest on shaky rationalist assumptions. We announce what's right and true, and others will salute and magically implement our ideas. If they don't, do we then blame the real world for not listening? This is the road not to critical planning scholarship, but to self-righteousness and irrelevance, from the right or the left. Too many planning theorists never finish the sentence that begins, "when I am planning," comma. And careful analysis of grounded planning practices go begging as a result. So to explore the possibilities of planning practices then, we should stop rediscovering with mock surprise political conditions of power, conflict, uncertainty. Oh my God, who would have thought? Instead, we have to presume complexity, not hide it, so expertise is always going to matter. We have to presume plurality, that stakeholders differ in their values and interests, and so planners will always face disagreements, disputes, and conflicts. We have to assume, surely, that planners don't work alone. They're interconnected, interdependent, neither solo nor in silos. And so they must be skilled negotiators, not pontificators. We have to assume, too, that institutions matter. Structures of resources and regulations, power and organization, access and agendas set the stages on which planners act. History will matter. Naysayers and skeptics will remember the failures of past promises and past planners, and that's the arena into which any new planning ideas enter at their own risk. So any planner's words of, "trust me, I'm an expert," right, are likely to fall less on deaf than on suspicious ears. This all means that perpetually discovering, yet once again, that planning is political, that power matters, is just backwards. If these practical conditions confront planners, as we all know they do, we have to ask, surely, okay, given these realities, how best to go on now? This is the heart of planning's pragmatic imperative, asking, now what? Without addressing that question, we risk reducing scholarly criticism to pseudo-scholarly complaint. Now, to take the grounded practices, the micropolitics of planning seriously, it helps to see that planners work typically in between multiple and conflicting stakeholders. They are not mediators of multi-party disputes, but they can learn two very practical lessons from such mediators. The first is this: mediators don't make agreements any more than midwives make babies. Mediators don't make agreements any more than midwives make babies. I will save you the excursion to ask you who makes the babies. In Sheffield, women were blushing In Italy, they got it right away. We talk about that after the lecture. So, mediators don't make agreements any more than midwives make babies. Planners, too, may help to deliver workable projects, but without stakeholder ownership, best intentions often remain just intentions. Second lesson, parties with deep value differences can disagree fundamentally about what their gods require of them, but they can nevertheless often agree where to put the road signs, how many feet the setback should be. That suggests that much more may be possible in the face of ordinary, if deep value disputes, than many of us in planning expect. To see planners as always in between stakeholders suggests a less planner-centric and a more catalytic view of their work. We might see planners as sources of information and expertise, of course, but also as contributing to process design and even to deliberative invention, enabling stakeholders to merge learning and analysis, coalition building, and problem solving too. But in complex and fluid settings, we don't find planners following recipes or rule books. We find them improvising creatively and pragmatically. But how, practically speaking, not just with good intentions, can they really do that, improvise well, in realistically politicized, complex, and contentious settings? Answering that question is the task to address now, by examining planning cases that appear to have almost nothing in common. We can begin in Cleveland, we move on to New Orleans, and then we go to Albuquerque, New Mexico. So in Cleveland, Norman Krumholtz was thrilled to go to work for Carl Stokes in 1968. Carl Stokes was a high-profile African-American mayor, the first African-American mayor in a city of over 500,000, with a liberal agenda, and he faced all of the major problems of American cities: poverty, unemployment, troubled schools, abandoned housing, racial discrimination, allegations of corrupt politics to begin with. Krumholtz found himself soon not rewriting the city's 20-year-old general plan, but devising an innovative policy planning report setting a new equity agenda for the city's planning staff. The city planners would devote themselves to the goal, as Krumholtz put it, of providing choices for those with few, whether these involved housing or transport choices, open space, or public service options. But he actually did far more than that. Faced at one point with the prospects of a freeway that threatened to displace hundreds of poor families through the downtown, in the center city, Krumholtz discovered a vacuum in City Hall. None of the established city departments considered the freeway and its impacts their problem. His staff stepped into the vacuum, and he soon found himself in a coalition of strange bedfellows with representatives of wealthier suburbs. Together, they achieved a reallocation of $100 million of freeway funds toward transit in Cuyahoga County. But Krumholtz had inherited a department with, as he said, low morale, widespread absenteeism, and agency drift. He writes, "I was determined to avoid that fate. I had to make planning myself and my staff all visible. Whereas my predecessor had avoided the mayor and council, I almost immediately became a regular at Mayor Stokes' cabinet meetings," he says. "I hadn't been invited, nor was I disinvited. I simply attended, introduced myself, and began participating along with the other directors." No one expected this from a planning director, but they welcomed it, he says. I was immediately accepted. In no time, I was getting information and assuming roles and assignments from the cabinet meetings. Krumholtz worked hard, too, to cultivate good relationships with the press, but the political winds were hardly friendly, and city council deal-making often threatened planning on the merits. At one point, the city council responded to a new proposal of Krumholtz's with, "Shit, I ain't got time for planning." Nevertheless, the planners worked with city departments on projects small and large, here shifting cleanup responsibility for the parks from the city to the state, there helping the sanitation department save many thousands of dollars by more efficiently rerouting trucks. Krumholtz's staff learned the hard way, though, finding early on that their well-intentioned analysis of police deployments fell on deaf ears and a very loud, unresponsive silence. But a deceptively simple case of planning in the face of an oncoming winter storm provides an instructive window, a sort of microcosm, on the Krumholtz's style and approach. He wrote, "Our ability to survive the change from Mayor Stokes, the Democrat, to Mayor Perk, the Republican, was probably aided by our work in Operation Snowbird, an effort to become visibly useful to Perk early in his term." And I'll quote him at some length here, but it's short. "Snow removal is an important and annually recurring issue in Cleveland politics. Mayors are frequently chastised for their lack of response to major snowfalls. Perk was inaugurated in the second week of November, and I suggested to him before his first press conference that if the snow removal issue came up, he should respond by saying he'd have a plan within a week. We had no plan at all, but my staff were sure we could put one together in a hurry. Sure enough, the subject came up at the press conference, and Perk responded as we suggested, and we got to work immediately." He goes on, "The plan we prepared was done with the assistance of the commissioner of the service department, who had the responsibility for snow removal. It was built around a simple probability model. As the prevailing pattern of winds brought snow closer and closer to the city, the information would be reported at checkpoints, and more street salting and snow removal equipment would be activated. At 90% probability, the entire snow removal fleet would be on duty." He goes on a little bit. "We laid this concept out in 4 days, supported it with large-scale, simple graphics that we knew would photograph and televise well. Mayor Perk, well briefed, called his press conference and outlined the procedures of the snow removal plan that we'd given him. The media were impressed. Perk had identified himself as a leader who was on top of the issues of the day, able to respond rapidly. He may have realized for the first time, since we were previously unknown to him, that his planners could be prompt and useful in more than zoning and land use matters." Now, this not really so simple story, the microcosm of Krumholtz's planning approach, reveals far less about storm mitigation than it does about politicians' needs for recognition, planners' reputations, the timing and responsiveness of expertise, media-friendly graphics and presentations, agency networking, and practical public benefit. Working for 3 radically different mayors over 10 years, Krumholtz was deeply entangled in the Cleveland municipal bureaucracy. Hardly able to act alone, his staff were closely connected to the Planning Commission, the City Council, city departments, the local press, neighborhood organizations, state agencies, the local Chamber of Commerce, and many others. Where they could act, as in the snow removal case, the planners needed to act not unilaterally, but carefully, collaboratively, and in coalitions with others. So on then to New Orleans. When Hurricane Katrina flooded the city in early September 2005, Ken Reardon was Cornell's head of department of city and regional planning. He had immersed his many students over several decades in action research projects with low-income communities of color in Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and Illinois. He had a national reputation for resident-based community planning work, and he had earned the trust of community activists, including Wade Rathke, founder and then national director of ACORN, Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, is what ACORN stands for. ACORN was one of the nation's largest grassroots membership-based community organizing networks. ACORN's national headquarters were in New Orleans, and soon after Katrina struck, Rathke asked Reardon if he and his students might work with ACORN members in the devastated 9th Ward so that residents might return to their homes after the storm and after the flood and rebuild. Rebuilding, though, soon faced an additional challenge. In Washington, D.C., the Urban Land Institute proposed that wide areas of the poorest and hardest hit neighborhoods in New Orleans should be greened, and they put a number of green dots on the map. And these would be declared open space and parkland, and this proposal threatened to prevent long-established neighborhood residents, mostly black, from going home and putting their lives back together. With planning faculty and students at Cornell, the University of Illinois, and Columbia too, Reardon led an ambitious effort to partner with ACORN Housing, an ACORN affiliate, to assess damage in the lower 9th Ward, to review and refine neighborhood plans, and to gauge how residents might realistically return. But Reardon had to find ways to work with an activist partner, ACORN, whose own organizing staff, despite Rathke's invitation, were deeply suspicious of so-called planning, which seemed to them to mean slow analysis, often weakly linked to any real implementation. With Rathke's request for help, Reardon faced quite a job. He led an academic department, not a consulting firm. How would his faculty and students work with aggressive and impatient community organizers 1,000 miles away, when the local government of storm-devastated New Orleans was barely functioning, aided more in principle than in fact by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, whose acronym soon appeared in widespread graffiti all across the city, and it read on telephone poles, FEMA, fix everything my ass. Right? It was all over the city. The Acorn University Planning Initiative reached far beyond inventorying and organizing existing plans and past studies. On a crucial field trip to New Orleans, faculty and student teams worked with Acorn Housing on two linked fronts. One group of paired teams walked the neighborhoods to talk to returning residents who had begun rebuilding. What was their experience? What did they most need for rebuilding or relocation? Had they received help from the city, the state, or federal sources? A second set of teams was armed with handheld geophysical data recorders, and they assessed the extent of damage on 2,000 or so properties. Was the house still standing? How high was the watermark? Was the roof intact? And so on. Their objective was to learn where might the costs of rebuilding be prohibitive, and where might those costs make it possible. The resulting data analysis fed a draft planning report presented several months later to an Acorn assembly of community leaders and city and state officials. Reardon recounted it this way. He says, "We had something in these surveys and interviews that nobody else had. We had collected detailed information about the physical condition of the existing building stock, data that showed, it turned out, that the area was in much better condition than many people thought, and that a great many of the houses could in fact be cost-effectively rehabbed. Evidence of the residents' desires to return, along with the information that the houses were in better shape than many believed, put us in a position to make a very strong argument in favor of future public investment in the lower Ninth Ward." Over 18 months, the Acorn University Partnership led to Planning Commission hearings and City Council support for the Planning Initiative's proposals. Not least of all, in a widely publicized press conference, Recovery czar Ed Blakely announced that the city would target $145 million for rebuilding in the Ninth Ward. Now, that announcement did not guarantee the spending, but it removed from the public agenda the looming threat of the greening of the Ninth that had so threatened residents from returning home. So, on to Albuquerque. When the phone rang, planning and architecture professor Rick Richardson was sitting in his office at the University of New Mexico's Community and Regional Planning Program. The city's redevelopment director was asking for help. The city had hired a planning and landscape architecture firm to produce a new plan for several miles of the North 4th Street corridor. After 2 years of work and public funding, the consultants had presented their plan, and all hell broke loose. The new plan hit a brick wall. The dormant merchants associations sprang back to life to oppose the plan. Neighborhood organizations were also up in arms. The consultants' plan effectively was DOA, dead on arrival. Could Richardson help, the question was. Would he call some meetings and try to move forward? No quick meetings, he said. He wanted several weeks to see what merchants and neighbors had in mind, what they found objectionable in the consultant's plan, and what they hoped for in the corridor. When he had had those conversations and sensed that the merchants and neighborhood residents might meet productively, he asked if they'd consider mediation to resolve their differences. "What's mediation?" they said. Here's what it meant in Albuquerque. Richardson asked merchants and neighborhood members alike to nominate 6 working representatives with 6 alternates, so the 2 groups of 12 could meet, discuss, and negotiate their concerns in a disciplined way. He suggested a process design. On Wednesdays, the working representatives would meet together to learn, to bring in experts about the issues they found pressing. The legal status of land use regulations in the corridor, the concerns of transportation experts, the needs of the fire department's vehicles, and so on. But on Saturdays, the representatives would turn their attention to each other, negotiating to satisfy their many disparate interests: the safety of children crossing the street, the access of customers to local businesses, a pedestrian-friendly streetscape, adequate parking for merchants, and on and on. This was no easy process. Residents attacked merchants for valuing automobile speed and parking over family safety concerns. Merchants attacked residents for wishing to put a fancy cafe on every corner and for dismissing the value of a strong economic base in the community. They had walking tours. They had false starts. They hit dead ends. At a seeming impasse, a group member called Richardson one evening and wanted to be anonymous, but he had an observation and a question. Residents seemed more concerned about the streetscape. He said, residents seem more concerned about the streetscape's pedestrian-friendly look. Merchants seem more concerned about the regulatory hurdles and the costs of improving their properties. Could they take advantage of these differing priorities? Richardson floated the idea with the group, and with fresh work, it provided a basis for an agreement that satisfied key concerns of each side. Within 6 months or so from convening, Richardson had brought a newly crafted, collaboratively produced plan for the North 4th Street corridor to the City Planning Commission, and there he became the victim of his own success. Great, they said. So now go back and engineer the details so it can really work. So Richardson, surprised, congratulated the working groups, who then reorganized with that new mandate, and several months later, the freshly engineered North 4th Street plan then won the City Council's formal approval, along with the Planning Commission's approval. So Richardson had designed a process enabling merchants and neighborhood organizations to meet together to explore interests, values, and goals, to collect and assess data, to bring in needed expertise, to design and redesign options, to get further engineering advice and services as required, and more. He had managed and mediated these meetings. He enabled the parties to listen to each other, to identify key issues, to do analysis and invent options, but the parties had crafted the agreement. The midwife had helped, but the parents produced the healthy baby. Now, these three cases, Krumholtz in City Hall, Reardon post-Katrina, New Orleans, City Hall is devastated, Richardson, North 4th Street. These three cases quite obviously differ a great deal. Krumholtz worked within city government. Reardon partnered a university-based effort with Acorn, both well removed from local government. Richardson responded to a failure of governance. The contracted plan was dead. Yet politics and inequality set the stage for each of these cases. Conflict pervades them all. Substantial uncertainty about what to do characterizes them all. These planners had few rules to follow, no prescribed process to dictate their actions. They had multiple and conflicting goals as well. Increase choices for those with few, lessen injustice, inform public action, protect the environment, improve transportation systems, among other goals. Clearly, or not so clearly then, in their very different contexts, they had to improvise, and to do that practically and creatively. But that's just our problem. What in the world does it mean to improvise practically and creatively in planning contexts that are this political, this contentious, and this uncertain? Right? So we can begin to answer that question by pointing to what their practices in these three very different cities shared. So consider first several similarities. First, they all depended heavily on expertise. Not just their own, but that of their staff and independent experts as well. Sometimes they did planning analysis in-house, in City Hall or the university. Sometimes they asked for help formally, inviting expert testimony, as Richardson did in Albuquerque. Other times informally. These practitioners all resisted the autonomy of expertise, as if they knew the wisdom of the saying, if you have a hammer, you look for nails. Right? They knew that bringing in experts too early could lead to the solutions that the experts felt qualified to deliver, even if these weren't the problems or the solutions that the residents and politicians found most important. Second, they all had to decipher history and context by coming to terms with what they had at hand to work with, both spatially and socially. Spatially, they had to learn about the freeway or the deteriorating parks, the flooded Ninth Ward, the North 4th Street corridor. Socially and politically, though, they had to learn about support and opposition, inequalities of power and privilege, and so about their room for movement in light of key stakeholders' interests and values, hopes and fears. Working across institutional boundaries to learn in these ways, they had not only to talk but to listen, not only to present themselves as capable but to pay attention. Here they had not just to take other actors seriously, but to ask good questions, tapping into others' concerns. And as they listened carefully, they laid the groundwork for future collaboration and coalitions as they assessed others' willingness to act, others' energy for change. So Krumholtz went to the mayor's cabinet meetings to identify pressing concerns, to identify clients and collaborators, to match his staff's technical talents to other agencies' needs. Richardson convened stakeholders to negotiate actions, not just to collect information. Reardon did door-to-door surveys, social and physical, to feed proposals that Acorn could support and advocate. So here, these practitioners assessed not only their contexts, but what mattered centrally in them, right? Including who was excluded. Here they were asking what deserved attention, not only asking what were the facts, but asking what were the facts that mattered. Third, they all did more than plan making. They did produce plans and proposals as guides for public action, to be sure, as documents to crystallize public support, shifting funding for parks or transit in Cleveland, putting an end to the prospect of greening the 9th in New Orleans, creating new strategies for North 4th Street. Plans mattered, but so did coalition building, implementation, rebuilding, and actually negotiating new municipal services. So they all also learned, not just as individual practitioners, reflectively, as Don Schoen so well argued, but they learned together with others, deliberatively, to identify problems and opportunities, to invite testimony from experts, to then create coalitions. They were deliberatively working together, not just individually reflecting, to create results at times that nobody had clearly in mind when they first came together. Fourth, they all stepped into ongoing processes of discussion, debate, and negotiation that they had to navigate and even redirect at times. Krumholtz wasn't alone fighting the freeway, caring about transits or parks or storms or municipal services. Reardon had to navigate a maze of public and nonprofit post-Katrina response initiatives along with those of Acorn. Richardson had city departments to work with and disparate organizations of neighborhood residents and merchants to address. They all saw themselves as embedded and working with potentially influential actors. They all needed to do research, but it was action research, defined by the prospects of action of their clients or collaborators. None of them believed simply in what seems to be a quaintly rationalistic academic model: plan first, then act. They all knew that before they could plan, they needed a reading of possibility too. Shielding Cleveland from snow was not a possibility. Deploying city equipment was. Raising ground levels in New Orleans was not a possibility. Allowing selective rebuilding and targeting investment was. Resurrecting the independent consultants plan, dead on arrival, seemed not a possibility. So Richardson explored an action research alternative: let the parents make the baby with whatever expertise they might need along the way. All of these planners then, in their different contexts to be sure, put into practice effective collective intelligence systems for action. They each integrated learning and action. They connected systematic analysis to prospective implementation. They anticipated conflicts and built coalitions as a result, all to support public serving actions. Now, these similarities suggest a more general argument, a framework. about how Krumholtz, Reardon, and Richardson each improvised in the different but complex, contested, and political environments that they faced. In situation after situation, we can see they were improvising, not only in but with the context at hand. In each case, they were required both to ask and to evoke answers to three central, complementary but distinct questions. Each contributed significantly to getting effective planning work done. And these three questions were these. First, questions of diagnosing what mattered. What's significant? What matters here? Second, questions of leveraging expertise and technical argument. What do we know or don't? What do we need to find out here? Third, questions of crafting actions with others, negotiating with, not just against, others to act. Question is, what could we do here? Right? These are distinct questions of what's important, what do we know, and what can we do? We can see, I think, that when we try to ask these three specific questions more generally, we typically turn to distinctly different kinds of processes, if not methods, to answer them. Conversations and interviews, focus groups, for example, might help with the diagnosis of what matters. But then we turn to research reports, scientific findings, and expert testimonies to help us address what's known and not known in a given case. But gauging what we can really do in a case, in contrast, will grow less from dialogues, less from research reports, and more from actual processes of negotiation. So in Cleveland, New Orleans, and Albuquerque, these practitioners had first enmeshed themselves in processes of conversation and dialogue, one-to-one meetings, interviews, networks, storytelling, listening, and so on, so they could decipher just what situation or context they were really in, with what salient and pressing issues at any given time. In all three cities, they engaged in cultivated processes of expert debate, arguments, data analysis, technical findings and recommendations, expert testimony and analysis, and so on, so that as planners they could bring to bear available scientific expertise and critically accountable, not cooked, not preset findings. But third, they had all joined or convened processes of negotiation, crafting practical actions that others, not just the planners, could take to satisfy their various public and private, material and symbolic, hopes and needs, values and interests. The Cleveland snow removal case provides a simple illustration. Krumholtz could easily have hoped for some other agency to rise to the occasion. Instead, he asked his staff for a plan to match deployment of the snow removal equipment to the changing levels of storm severity. And so he gave to the mayor that plan, designed for presentation in turn to the broader public. The new mayor then looked good, competent, and prepared. The previously invisible planners gained a bit more reputation for being timely, relevant, technically proficient problem solvers. But this was unplanned, an improvised response oriented to public well-being. It combined context diagnosis, the impending storm and a vulnerable public, managing expertise, the mathematical model presented legibly for the media to use and actually show, and negotiated action, the coalition with the service commissioner, the trucks to deploy. In Albuquerque, Richardson's whole process depended on distinguishing yet integrating these three processes too. Asked by the redevelopment director to reconvene the conflicting parties, he delayed, he demurred. He wanted to speak with them individually and separately to learn what they cared about, what they might do together, and what he might do in any mediating role. Sensing possibilities, he proposed meetings on two parallel tracks, one explicitly devoted to learning from expertise, legal, financial, engineering, and otherwise, and one devoted effectively to negotiating together. That design, interweaving our three processes of diagnosis, expert argumentation, and negotiation, then enabled the parties, with his mediating assistance, to devise a well-engineered, collaboratively produced plan that won the ratification of both Planning Commission and Council. In New Orleans, too, Reardon knew how much the planning teams had to learn after being asked by ACORN for assistance. They'd have to consult not only residents and ACORN organizers, but city and state officials, diverse technical experts to assess physical conditions through GIS analysis, damage inventories, and other research reports. But Reardon knew too, we see, that without a partner with muscle, without a partner who could influence action on the plans the team might produce, yet one more well-intentioned plan might gather dust on academic shelves. So the New Orleans Planning Initiative, too, had involved a three-pronged effort of citizen interviews and networking, systematic physical inventory and GIS analysis, and also, and not least of all, maintaining a working relationship with Acorn, who could get the attention of New Orleans and Louisiana politicians and officials to take the analysis seriously. In each case, this triad of intertwined practical processes, ongoing dialogue for context diagnosis, expert debate to leverage technical analysis, and negotiations to craft working agreements on action, what to do now, carried the day. This triad, over time, became essentially a triple helix of related, complementary, and practically sensitive moves to support public action, shared problem solving, even greater hope about what in Cleveland, New Orleans, and Albuquerque could happen now. But this triple helix, these three intertwined processes, were not and are not self-propelled or self-implementing. They can be done well, or they can run off the rails, go wrong. Done well, processes of dialogue and conversation can surface presumptions, probe expectations, refine agendas, develop working understandings, as Reardon found by interviewing Ninth Ward residents. But done poorly, these processes can be just talk or fall on deaf ears, as Krumholtz found with the police. Done well, processes of argumentation to leverage expertise can accomplish joint fact-finding, not only preempting a spiraling war of rival experts, but reframing problems and solutions alike, as Richardson discovered in his Wednesday learning sessions. But done poorly, these processes of expert argument can escalate worsening relationships as debates over method can shade into personalistic insinuations of bias, hidden agendas, bad faith, and worse. Similarly, done well, processes of negotiating actions can be creative, timely, focused, generating or even maximizing joint gains for all parties, to the pleasant surprise of Richardson's parties. But done poorly, processes of negotiations can produce the lousy compromises that we can call lose-lose outcomes for interested parties. Right? These processes don't run themselves. So if planners are going to improvise well then, they will need training and education in these three distinct but complementary domains. To gain diagnostic skills about what matters and what counts, to gain argumentative expertise about the substance of the cases, as well as to gain creative and productive negotiating abilities to get things done. So recall the problem I've set out for us, how to understand creative and pragmatic improvisation in planning, not in the absence of politics and conflict, but when planning settings are complex, contested, and fluid, when yesterday's excellent solutions can't easily be repeated today, and when planners have no rule book to follow. I've tried to give a practical but theoretically clear account of how planners can and ought to improvise in such challenging contexts. Clearly, in my account, to improvise practically does not mean do whatever you want, as if anything goes. It does not mean to ignore rules and responsibilities. Obviously, too, it does not mean to ignore expertise and technical analysis. But neither can an account of astute improvisation be more traditionally prescriptive, telling planners what to do regardless of the context. For that, of course, is part of the point. Any planners improvising well have to work both in and with the context at hand, their particular context at hand, even or especially when the context needs to be deciphered and explored. So most obviously then, to say that planners in messy contested settings have to improvise, to fall less foul of politics, with this triad, or the ongoing triple helix of elements, diagnosis, expertise, and negotiation. This suggests no new rocket science, no extraordinary genius, but instead it draws upon many planners' existing capacities to worry about three basic problems. They need to learn what matters in typically ambiguous and confusing contexts. They need to use their own and leverage independent expertise. They need to make also a difference to connect what they learn and devise to people with enough authority or power to act to solve problems. So consider finally the practicality of this framework, this triple helix. Consider the risks of ignoring any one of these three questions or processes. First, if we as planners attend only to expertise and negotiation power, right? If we as planners attend only to expertise and negotiation and ignore dialogues for context diagnosis, we risk solving the wrong problems. Right? We act on expertise, but it may be the wrong problem. Second, if we pay attention to context diagnosis and to negotiation, but ignore relevant expertise, we act on important problems, but we risk stupidity and ignorance. Third, if we attend only, though, to context diagnosis and expertise, as we often seem to do, but ignore the need to negotiate, then we risk talk, report after report barely read, pages of smart strategies that will sit on the shelf that no one will implement, right as they may be, but all too soon to fall foul of politics. So in a range of messy and contentious contexts, then, creative and pragmatic planning improvisation rests centrally, I've argued, on actually asking and answering over time three recurring questions. What matters? What do and don't we know? And what can we do? These are questions theoretically of ethics, science, and pragmatism. That's the planning theory talk. But these are questions practically that we, all of us, can ask and answer to, as we will have to improvise in contexts at least as different as a politicized Cleveland, a flooded New Orleans, and a less spectacularly contentious Albuquerque. Thank you very much. That's my best shot.
Okay, so an opportunity now to ask John questions, argue with him, challenge him.
Can I make a real quick footnote and then I'll go to you?
Yeah.
You'll notice there are two words that I am very associated with that weren't mentioned at all in the last hour. One is communicative, or communication. The other is participation. The whole hour is about both of them. But that's not the language we need to make progress on. So please, start us off.
Hi there, I'm Ben Clifford from the Bolton School of Planning. I'm not going to talk about communicative planning. I wanted to ask you really about methodology, actually.
Sure.
And as the sort of in-house anthropologist.
Sure.
What are these cases, just thinking about the selection of these cases you presented us, are they perhaps sort of typical stories, or do you think they're atypical stories, perhaps because of the individuals concerned? And then how did you go about actually capturing the stories of these?
It's a wonderful question. I'm not interested in the average case. I'm interested in the exemplary case. The analogy I can most easily use is if we're looking for good cooking, we want to go somewhere tonight for dinner, and somebody tells us, well, this place over here is really average. You know, it's sort of in between the best and the worst of London. We're not going to be interested. I'm not interested in what the average planning case is. I'm interested in exemplary work and what we might learn from people who work in very difficult contexts, get things done in ways that are not heroic. I mean, it doesn't help to point to three geniuses. I don't think that Norman Krumholtz, Ken Reardon, and Rick Richardson are geniuses. They're skilled, but we have lots of skilled people. And by the time they get out of our programs, they'll be a little more skilled, and by the time they have a few years at work, they're even more skilled. I'm looking for instructive exemplary cases. And so social science doesn't help us very much, partly because looking for the exemplary is fully value-laden. So I'm not asking what do most people think. I'm trying to see where people pushing the boundaries of planning in ways that the rest of us can learn from. And yeah, so that's a first level response. We'll come back, right? Anybody else, please?
Hi, thank you very much. Yvonne Ryden from BSP. Very interesting, provocative stories. I'm interested in the kind of, whether there was a very particular kind of window of opportunity for the planners in these different situations. Because when you tell the story of a planner who decides to help with a snow plan, in the UK that doesn't figure. That's not what planners do. They don't have the scope to do that. If they went into the Office of Parks and Recreation, or whatever it's called, they'd be shown the door out again.
Sure.
So,
but it wasn't a story about snow, right?
No. But the point is,
it was a story about politics. No.
Sure. But it's about, there seemed to be a particular window of opportunity that these people were operating within. That allowed them certain affordances, if you like.
This is the amazing thing about. I think it's one of the wonderful things about the field, the anthropology of practice. Certainly about studying mediator, of which I have a couple books. Looking backwards, you say, "Oh, there were these opportunities," but on day one, they saw just a mess. They had the Acorn organizers said, planning? We don't got time for planning. It's just what the city council guy, this was the city council president of Cleveland saying this to the planning director. We don't have time for you. We got deals to make. So in the moment, they didn't see windows of opportunity. The question for them was, how in the world do we work in these messy situations? And that's really what I'm trying to answer. Krumholtz knew. So Krumholtz had a chief of staff in his department, Ernie Bonner, who was the technical guy. And Norman was Mr. Outside, and Bonner was Mr. Inside. And together they did things neither one of them could have done alone. Krumholtz networked to agencies, found problems, built connections, was able to sniff out problems early on, and then go back to Bonner and say, hey, I need an analysis like this. And Bonner could get it done in a timely way, and then Krumholtz could take it back to an agency director or a state official, whatever. So there was this pairing. And with Reardon, he never talked about it. He knew instinctively he needed a partner with muscle so that if the projects could do any good analysis, somebody would listen. But there was he didn't see any window of opportunity. He saw, it was a horror, the devastation of Katrina. And they collected the data. They were shocked from the data. It was traditional land use planning analysis. They found in the 9th Ward an L-shaped band of properties whose elevation was higher than in the middle of that L, where it was lower. And so rebuilding in the lower section was going to be impossible, but rebuilding on the L was possible. And they didn't know that. They had no idea. But when they had that result, along with the interviews, so it wasn't just a set of technicians from outside, but merged with the interviews and with Acorn's ability to turn out politicians, they were able to present that analysis. So the window of opportunity is looking backwards. We see what got done. But, yeah, okay. We'll come back, please.
Building on the first question, question.
Sure.
You said that you were interested in extreme cases. Does it mean you have...
No, exemplary cases.
Exemplary cases.
Not
okay.
extreme cases.
So would this include extreme cases of planning failures or great planning disasters, as Peter Hall wrote? And can we equally learn from spectacular failures that do not show the processes and ingredients that you told us about?
I'm sure we can, but I've always found 99% of the planning literature tells us why nothing's going to change, why power is going to prevent everything, why inequality, why, back to the cooking exam, why the political economy of agriculture means, that we're never going to get a good meal. But, if we want to go out tonight and somebody says, well, the political economy of agriculture is just screwing everything up, that's really not going to answer the question for us to find a good cook. So I found most of the literature in planning is about why it doesn't work. And it seems to me a failure, I think it's a conceptual and intellectual failure that we don't start from the premises of inequality, power, hegemony, private ownership, what you want. And then ask, okay, so what does that mean for better planning? Life is short. Let's get on with it. We can't keep reading articles whose last paragraph is, you know what? It's all about power. Please. No, still. I'm thinking of, I finished my, you weren't even born. I finished my dissertation a very long time ago. And I was interested in applications of critical social theory to practice and the notions of praxis, if you want. But how many of you have ever heard of Paulo Freire? Yep. Ooh, only a few hands. All right. So I got associated with Habermas. Habermas is important because Habermas does the intellectual foundations of what Paulo Freire, as a radical adult educator, was doing. But that's maybe another story. But even then, so as I finished and was trying to do this work, and I looked at the planning theory literature, it was this incredibly boring rediscovery of power, class, hegemony. Okay, I get it. Now what? I don't know if that answered. Come back around, yes. And run here, sure, please.
Yeah, Rosemary Wakeman from Fordham University in New York. So I'm going to get
from New York.
Very presumptuous.
You're jet lagged too.
Question, yeah. But to get back to power, just for a moment,
Sure.
Your first question on what matters, isn't that to a great extent a political decision? Planners make alliances, they make political alliances, they make social alliances. What matters is, in fact, a question of political power to a certain degree within a city and within the kind of community negotiations that actually take.
All three of these questions are about power. What matters is a question of power. What's the first thing on the table in any. In many situations, having that conversation surfaces other issues, right? There's not just one thing, but a set of things. Expertise is certainly political, right? Who's been trained? What experts are available? Who has the funding to do it? That's political. And the negotiation work is political absolutely all the way through. So all three of these questions are deeply political. Someone said, well, what about justice? There's issues of injustice in every one. Who's excluded, the bias of experts, how negotiations proceed, all the way through.
Okay,
yeah.
Rob.
Yeah, Robin Hickman from Product School of Planning. Do you think the incremental progress consensus building is enough?
That's a third word I didn't mention. I didn't say a word about consensus.
Incremental
Go ahead.
Is incremental progress enough to make the great steps that are required, say, to act against climate change?
No.
What's the solution there? Is it?
So you're going to tell me the solution to climate change?
Well, no, I think it's. can we have this collaborative process to make the great steps against climate change or social equity, some of the great policy challenges?
You know, was it Churchill who said, don't, you know, democracy is a rotten system, the problem is what are the alternatives, right? The other one that's almost as good as the two guys at the bar who say democracy is the theory that government by 30 fools is better than government by 1. We'll leave Trump I'm inclined to think that's true, but it's a tricky question. I don't think anybody's scheme that we know about is a surefire solution to climate change denial, right? I'm defending this, first of all, with respect to other accounts of what planners do, which seems to me either typically privilege expertise first and then action, and it seems to me we know that's fraught with problems, or an incrementalism that, as Lindblom wrote in his amazing, The Signs of Muddling Through, an amazing article, he said, look, so an incremental decision is a good one if it gathers the agreement of the heads of the agencies. And that's contingent on every interest having its watchdog. And then he had the intellectual courage to say, on this account, a plan or an agreement is good, even if we can't say what it's good for. It's amazing. He wrote that in the original piece, right? And what he meant was, if Nick as head of the department and John as head of another, they work out a modus vivendi for the next month, that's fine, basically. They don't need the grand plan. They don't need the rational, comprehensive review of all the alternatives. They can muddle through. This seems to me goes a long distance past muddling through, because it makes systematic learning sort of essential. It raises all sorts of issues about exclusion and representation. So in the question of who matters is a question of privilege, certainly. I mean, how are you going to ask, in the question of what matters, how are you going to ask about what matters and be blind, in the States, so blind to racial privilege, for example? You got all white people around the table? What are you, crazy? All men? So on. So it's not a solution to climate change. It's not a solution to the overthrow of capitalism. I get that, but it seems to me there's a lot more connection here, to practice, to a range of political settings, to day-to-day work and organizing than in any other account you can give me.
It's Michael Edwards, Bartlett. I find this very stimulating and helpful. Like some other people, I'm trying to think how to take advantage of it and think how it helps eliminate the situations we're confronting here in London. And in a way, quite worrying is this, and I hope you can make a helpful comment, that we have a long history of trying to negotiate housing policy between different tenure groups and residents, between housing providers and owners and financial institutions and lenders and city planners and so on. And that's kind of carries on. But we've got a rather new set of real big problems because the extraordinary inflation of housing prices in London has meant that the kind of land use barriers between residential land and non-residential land are kind of bursting. And industrial land, high streets, workshops are being sucked into use for speculative house building.
Yeah.
And we and planners in localities and planners in City Hall are trying to engage in this process, have negotiations, do consultations. We've got a lot of new generation of planners in our City Hall, and then very open to new ways of working, and they'd be very good about consulting. But there's nobody to consult with, because the economy in London, very diverse, never got organised to defend itself. In terms you used just now, there are no watchdogs. There's nobody there. There are big banks and the huge corporations, but there's no organisational structure to engage with in ordinary industrial estates and workshop neighbourhoods so there's a kind of dilemma. A lot of our students are working in this field. We have 50 students this year working on these kind of problems in predominantly production zones of London. And you can gather a load of information, you can do your stage 1 and stage 2 very well, but it's very hard to find the locus of power with whom anybody can negotiate. And any insights or helpful suggestions you have about that would be terribly, terribly welcome. What do you do when the power
there
stuff isn't really...
Two words come to mind. Two words come to mind. One from this and the other from the room. The two words are coalitions. I mean, what jumps out for me is sort of really thinking, what kind of conceivable coalitions might there be, and really to explore that, right? Coalition, question of coalition building, and where that takes you. The second word is gallant. Gallant. Nick. It's Nick. Who's much closer to the field than I am. So I will leave you with coalitions, but
ask him.
But ask him, exactly.
If we thought he had the answer, we wouldn't have asked you to come. Anyway. So maybe time for one last question before we draw things to a close.
Thank you. You talked about 3 skills. Right?
Yeah.
The diagnostic skills.
Yeah.
Argumentative skills and...
Oh no, the expertise, argumentative expertise. But you know something about something.
Yeah.
You have some real background in housing.
So let's say, well,
and third, some negotiating skills.
Negotiations.
Yeah, 3.
So, well, I'm from the School of Planning. I'm a PhD student in planning. I learned about these 3 skills that you mentioned from experience. But you were saying that planners should study somehow about this kind of topic. So I was wondering how do you really how do you imagine you could teach these kind of skills? I'm talking about the school. How you really can learn to. I mean, as I said, I learned from this. I learned this from practice, not from school. And it's usually coming from practice. Yeah,
no, but I take it as sort of confirmation that you learn it in practice. Yeah. That this has resonance with your practice.
So, to what extent you can be learned in the school?
Yeah. No, it's a very crucial question, of course. Of the 3, so diagnostic, interpretive skills, let's say. Argument, the expertise, skills of expertise, negotiation skills. Of the 3, the traditional book knowledge and traditional scholarship is mostly in the second. Right? The first actually splits between, you have a whole lot of work in interpretation, in interpretive social science, in the humanities, for one thing. So a decent literature course or a decent anthropology course is going to teach you about layers of meaning and the skills of interpretation. So I'm not saying at all that the academy is not relevant to diagnostic skills. It's hugely relevant, but it's the humanities even more than the social sciences, for one thing. But the other thing, of course, that planning schools can do is have workshops, studios, work with clients, internships, immersion, so that planning students are working in a practical context, and they're going to school, and they put those two pieces together. And that works against the grain of thinking, oh, we're going to learn the, quote, knowledge first, and then we're going to go practice. That's crazy. Right? So, I mean, but that's just on the diagnostic problem. And the more, what I would think, I mean, the fascinating diagnostic piece is also, how do you listen? Right? How do you listen? And across the professions, when people are asked, you know, what are the crucial skills in the professional work? Listening comes out high on the list. Writing comes out depending, but listening comes out very high. Why? Because too many people don't keep their mouths shut and listen, and they say what their professors told them, independent of the context, and then they're treated, you know, as arrogant, as foolish, as presumptuous, as disrespectful, as dismissive, as well they might. And it's not too hard to teach students to shut up and listen, you know, and ask some questions. But so there's a lot on diagnosis that we could teach better, I think. On the argumentative expertise, I think that's what we traditionally do, and maybe we could teach less presumption and less arrogance. On the negotiating skills is more difficult. Again, it's more like the first. So there are courses, there are simulations, there are role plays, there is the necessity of learning from experience. There's certainly a lot of warnings you can give. You can tell people a lot about how not to negotiate. You know, and the listening will go some distance, you know, to be helpful there.
Okay.
You really in a rush?
No, I'll give you another 2 minutes.
Okay. There was a meeting in Vienna 2 years ago of old folks in planning. Peter was supposed to come, and he wasn't well enough, and he actually Skyped in. And I talked a little bit about some of this at this meeting in Vienna. And a regional economist got up, he was incensed. He said, but what about expertise? And he was responding partly to Judy Innes, who was a lecturer here before. And I said, look, if we're talking about participation, engagement, multi-stakeholder mediation, conflict resolution, we're not against expertise. We are against the autonomy of expertise, and we want to make sure that expertise is accountable. That's all. I've got nothing against medicine, economists, statisticians, but not autonomously. We're trying to work with this community about its problems, not what they are prepackaged, ready to deliver. That's the autonomy. And the problem is that the university, of course, trains our students in a complex world to latch on to their expertise as what distinguishes me. So they want to go into a situation and say, well, here's what I've learned. And we don't do the students a favor. We're not doing the students a favor or the communities a favor by having them go out, eager beaver, hey, look what I got for you.
Right,
so, okay, I'm muzzled.
Well, we've got quite a bit of listening, so I think now's the time to reconvene outside. Those of you who attend these events regularly will know that, in theory, there should be wine and refreshments outside. Those of you who were here last time will know that voracious students, locust-like, had already descended on our drinks and refreshments and eaten before we got to them. We have security here this evening, so can I end by inviting you to join us for drinks? But before we do that, could we say thank you very much in the traditional way to our speaker.
Thank you.